Mary Ellen Gurnick, born on September 3rd, 1947, grew up in sunny Southern California. She's described during her teenage years as a regular teenage girl who liked to do regular fun activities that teens would do during that time, like go to the local drive-in movies with her friends. She was described as a very pretty young lady and someone who loved the male gaze. She was one of those who some would describe as boy crazy, and according to one of her friends at the time, Barbara Favilla, the boys were just as crazy about her. Whenever Mary and her girls were out, she'd be the only one the boys would focus on. One of those boys was a young man named Robert Bob Samuels. Bob, whose birthday is September 20th, 1948, was a little younger than Mary, and he was her neighbor. Although he was smitten with the pretty girl next door, he was far too shy to even try to approach her. So he just admired her from a distance, and they went on to live their separate lives. Mary actually got married to her first husband, who she shared a daughter with. Her daughter's name is Nicole. And Bob went on to be a successful cameraman in Hollywood, working on feature films such as Colors, Real Genius, and Beverly Hills Cop 2. But as adults, the once teenage neighbors had crossed each other's paths again, and they started dating when Mary's daughter, Nicole, was a teenager herself back in 1980. And just as smitten Bob was with Mary when they were younger, he still was as adults. And he wasn't about to miss his chance with her again because he got married to her within 6 months of them dating. And he certainly accepted Nicole as his own because he ended up adopting her. According to Mary's friend Barbara, Bob and Nicole got along very well, and they were fond of having each other as a bonus daddy-daughter duo. Things were off to a great start for the new budding family. They got a house out in the suburbs of San Fernando Valley. Bob was a hard worker and was providing for his wife and Nicole. Mary was being well taken care of. You would think that all would have been happily ever after for them, but on the contrary, things had become the complete opposite of fulfilling. You see, Bob was more of a down-to-earth kind of guy, didn't need much to make him happy. Mary, on the other hand, needed all the excitement. She wanted the high fashions, the fast cars, the fast life. She needed to feel that adrenaline rush, that excitement. So Bob figured, well, maybe if I buy this Subway sandwich franchise and make my wife the manager, it'll give her something to do and she'd be happy with that. And it did, but not for very long. Some years after getting married, in October of 1986, Mary one day decided she'd write her husband a Dear John letter and let him know she's leaving him, and mentioned how she felt like the marriage had gotten stale, things just weren't working out, and she hoped they could remain friends. Bob had high hopes that they'd be able to maintain their marriage, but Mary went and filed for divorce regardless. They did have a separation trial, which resulted in Bob paying out $1,500 a month to help cover her living costs. Mary ended up selling the sandwich shop and moved into a condo with her daughter Nicole, and the legally married but separated couple went on to live separate lives. Then, tragedy struck. In the afternoon of Friday, December 9th, 1988, Mary and her daughter Nicole went over to Bob's Northridge home to drop off the dog they shared for the weekend. Upon arrival, Mary and Nicole discovered the place to be ransacked and Bob's deceased body with a shotgun blast in his head. Mary called 911, but when LAPD arrived at the home, they found Mary's behavior to be quite peculiar because she was too calm. So naturally, they brought her to the police station for questioning. Now, first things first, the officers who arrived on the scene stated that there was no indication of a break-in, and they felt as though the crime had been an inside job. Furthermore, while down at the police station, that boy crazy male gaze loving persona showed up front and center. Mary was described to be wearing a low-cut dress, emphasizing her cleavage, and was said to have been flirting with the officers, even going as far as rubbing one of the officers' head, telling him how she loved bald men. This is wild coming from a woman who just found her husband's head pretty much blown off. What's even wilder is, just some days after finding her husband deceased, Mary moved herself and Nicole back into Bob's Northridge home and filed a claim to collect the money from his life insurance policy. Since they were still legally married, she was able to collect money and assets totaling up to $500,000 US. Mary went on a spending spree. She bought her new boo, a man named Dean Grover, a white Porsche, running her $50,000 US in a brand new condo in Cancun for $180,000 US that she was planning on moving to with Dean. Plus, fur coats and all types of designer clothes, bags, and lingerie made of the finest threads for her and her daughter. Investigators found this fishy, so they started snooping around and interviewing some of Bob's friends. This is when they learned that Bob had planned on finalizing his divorce with Mary once he realized they were no longer getting back together for good, and he was ready to cut her off financially. But then in May of 1989, investigators received an anonymous tip advising them that they really needed to talk to 27-year-old Jim Bernstein. He was a boyfriend of Nicole's. Apparently, he knew some information that they'd find useful. Apparently, one of Mary's bar friends that she met at one of the bars she'd frequent during her many nights of partying told investigators that Mary had been shopping around for someone to kill Bob, but she ended up getting Jim to do the job for her. You see, she had manipulated Jim into believing that Bob was violent towards her, and even told him that Bob had been touching Nicole in ways that he shouldn't have, which really fueled the fire for Jim to get the job done in committing Bob's homicide. After learning of all of this, police brought both Mary and Jim in for questioning. Initially, they had the duo in separate interview rooms, and while Jim was all scary and shaken, Mary was cool as a cucumber, still flirting with the officers without a worry in the world, denying any and all allegations they asked her about. At this point, officers bring the two of them into an interview room together and leave them alone to speak to one another. While they were left alone, they were still being recorded. Not realizing they were being recorded, Jim told Mary that he believed either one of them or both of them were going to get arrested because the police knew 100% that they were the ones responsible for Bob's death. After a little while longer, officers came back into the interview room trying to get a confession out of Mary and Jim. But when neither of them caved in, police allowed them to leave. Now, this was upsetting to Mary, and she started to feel like Jim had the potential to fold under pressure. Then, 1 month later, in June of 1989, a couple was walking along a mountain road in Ventura County, and they came across a deceased body. They called 911, and as they came to investigate, they realized that the body was too badly decomposed to try and make out the identity there at the scene. Later on, fingerprints taken from the body allowed investigators to identify the deceased as Jim Bernstein, Nicole's boyfriend. At this point, police are going around asking questions to those close to Jim. This is when they find out from his boss, Matt Rao, that Jim had been confiding in him about his desire to confess to police about the role he played in Bob's death. So, investigators do some more snooping and find a $1,500 check written out to two men named Paul Gow and Darrell Ray Edwards. They brought Paul and Darrell in for questioning, and that was all they needed. Paul told investigators how they were hired and paid $5,000 US to take Jim out. So they strangled him and left him on the mountain road. When police asked who they were hired by, Paul told them they were hired by Mary Ellen Samuels. This is when detectives went and arrested Mary. Upon her arrest, they searched her home and they found a picture of Mary that was taken by her boo, Dean, in Cancun. The infamous photo was of Mary laying nude with her lady parts covered in $20,000 US, all in $100 bills, with the biggest grin on her face. This photo was used as evidence of motive. Mary had been charged with 2 counts of homicide, soliciting homicide, conspiracy, and a single count of attempted homicide. The trial for Mary began in May of 1994 and ended in July of 1994 with a jury finding her guilty of first-degree homicide, and the death penalty was suggested for her. In September 1994, she was sentenced to death. She was one of only 20 women on death row in the state of California. But in December of 2019, Mary's death sentence had been reversed. However, she still remains in prison to this day. As for her daughter Nicole, she was never implicated in any of these crimes, and Paul and Daryl are both out of prison today. Mary's greed and flashy lifestyle caused her to run up the entire $500,000 she received in just under a year, which earned her the name Green Widow. After setting up her husband's death built on lies and manipulation for money, then setting up her husband's killer's death, who just so happened to be her daughter's soon-to-be husband because, oh yeah, Nicole and Jim were on the way to getting married. And then spending up all the money, all Mary ended up with was nothing. Absolutely nothing. She never cared about Jim or anyone else for that matter. The only thing that mattered to her were monetary gains, material things, and the temporary attention of men who she probably don't get much of in a prison full of women now at 76 years old. Rest in peace, Robert Bob Samuels. I'm sorry that your legacy is synonymous with this horrific story. May your spirit linger with those who actually valued you while you were still here.